They left on a Friday morning. Jason and Melissa Hart, both 32, pulled out of their San Diego driveway in a dusty silver Jeep Cherokee, packed to the brim with camping gear, a cooler, 2 hiking backpacks, and a borrowed telescope. Their plan was simple: a weekend under the stars in the Mojave Desert, far from cell towers and calendars. Melissa had been craving silence. Jason had been craving space, the kind only a sky full of stars and miles of rock could give. They didn't tell many people, just Melissa's sister Sarah, who got a casual text around 9:12 a.m. "Morser, we're headed east. No signal, but we'll check in Sunday night. Love you." That was the last time anyone heard from them. By Saturday, no one noticed. They had no kids, no pressing weekend obligations, their absence didn't register. But by Monday morning, neither showed up for work. Emails bounced. Phones rang to voicemail. Sarah, uneasy, drove to their place. The lights were off, the front door locked, coffee cup still in the sink. The Jeep was gone. Their disappearance sparked little urgency at first. 2 adults. No signs of foul play. Maybe they extended the trip. Maybe they found a new trail, a canyon, a forgotten turnoff worth exploring. But by Wednesday, the facts no longer felt like coincidences. No credit card activity, no GPS signals, no return to the rental company for the borrowed telescope. Search and rescue got the coordinates for their likely route, Highway 247 toward the Mojave Preserve. Rangers checked known campsites. Drones scanned the brush. Helicopters flew low over washes and trailheads. But the desert was big, and the Jeep wasn't anywhere. Melissa's phone last pinged a tower outside Barstow. Jason's went dark even earlier. A receipt for gas at a remote outpost marked their last confirmed location. The Mojave has a way of swallowing things: time, footprints, people. And somewhere, in that 1,000-mile stretch of silence and heat, Jason and Melissa vanished. They met at a coffee shop in North Park, 2 creatives in a city that spun fast. Jason was a graphic designer who moonlighted as a guitarist. Melissa was a UX researcher with a Polaroid camera always hanging from her neck. They weren't loud about their love, but when you saw them together, it was obvious this was the real thing. They moved in together after a year, adopted a cat, took road trips through Big Sur, Yosemite, Baja. Friends called them adventure married, not officially hitched, but spiritually welded. They cooked together, camped together, built furniture together. They shared passwords and playlists. He kept her anxious thoughts grounded. She made his solitude less lonely. In photos, they looked cinematic: wind-blown hair, canyon sun behind them, beer bottles clinking in desert air. Their Instagram was full of national parks and black and white selfies, not filters or captions. Melissa's co-workers at the firm said she had desert energy, calm, capable, introspective. Jason's boss described him as the guy who always knew what everyone forgot. But underneath all that ease was a hunger. Not for each other, though, they had that too, but for something bigger. Melissa had talked for months about unplugging, about off-grid weekends and relearning quiet. Jason read survival manuals like bedtime stories. Neither of them feared the wild. If anything, it drew them in. So when they planned a weekend in the Mojave, nobody blinked. It was what they did. Another pinned location, another escape from city noise. But the silence this time was different. When the days passed with no contact, their friends felt the difference in their chests, a thrum of something wrong. These weren't careless people. They were planners, intentional. If they hadn't come back, it wasn't because they forgot, it was because they couldn't. The more you knew Jason and Melissa, the more impossible their disappearance felt. No fights, no debts, no secrets. They were the couple everyone envied, and that made their absence even harder to understand. Saturday, 3:40, 2 p.m. That's when Melissa's phone connected to a cell tower just outside Barstow, California. The ping was short, barely enough to register, but it gave investigators their first timestamp. Security footage from a nearby gas station showed the silver Jeep pulling in around the same time. Jason stepped out, filled the tank, then walked into the store. He bought 2 bottles of water, trail mix, and a map of the Mojave National Preserve. Melissa stayed in the car, scrolling through something on her phone, the glow catching her face through the windshield. There's no sound, no alarm, no sign of distress. It was an ordinary moment, but it was the last one anyone could verify. After that, nothing. Their GPS history, pulled later from Melissa's cloud account, showed a clear route east along Interstate 40. But just past Ludlow, the data takes a strange turn. The Jeep veered off the highway and onto a dirt road labeled Bristol Dry Lake Access. It's a narrow service route used mostly by utility workers, not the kind of road 2 weekend campers would take. From there, the trail grows faint. GPS signal drops. The final breadcrumb shows the vehicle heading south toward a region known locally as the Silent Divide, a stretch of desert with no cell coverage, no marked trails, and no water sources. It's a place most maps don't bother naming. Investigators were baffled. Why detour there? There were no campgrounds, no attractions. Only sand, rock, and heat. Maybe they got turned around. Maybe they were chasing a viewpoint. Maybe they saw something or someone. The hours after Barstow remain a void. A single blurry photo from Melissa's phone auto-backed up to the cloud days later through a background app sync. It shows a horizon of red rock and cloudless sky. In the corner, what looks like a metallic vent poking from the ground. It's time-stamped 5:14 p.m. After that, no uploads, no data, just silence. Something happened in those missing hours. A wrong turn, a decision, an invitation they didn't know was a trap. And from that moment on, Jason and Melissa Hart were no longer just travelers. They were the desert's secret. Monday morning came with inboxes full and coffee half warm. The office chatter returned to its usual hum, but something was off. Jason's desk sat untouched. Melissa's calendar pinged for a 9 a.m. strategy meeting. Neither showed. At first, it felt like a mistake. Maybe they forgot to email. Maybe they lost signal and were still somewhere under the stars. It wasn't like them, but it wasn't impossible. By noon, their phones still rang straight to voicemail. No text replies, no emails. Sarah, Melissa's sister, tried to stay calm. She called their landlord, no answer. She drove over herself. Their apartment was dark, curtains drawn, their cat pacing near the door, hungry and confused. She called the police. But in California, adults aren't considered missing just because they're late. Officers took the report but explained the 72-hour guideline. They're probably fine, one said. It's the desert. Could be a busted tire or no reception. But Jason and Melissa weren't impulsive. They didn't vanish for fun. By Tuesday, the silence became deafening. Sarah began calling hospitals, towing companies, ranger stations. No one had seen the Jeep. Their credit cards hadn't been used since Saturday. Bank accounts were untouched. No messages, no clues. It was like someone hit pause on their lives. Jason's boss reported it to the National Park Service. Melissa's employer filed a formal missing person report. Friends posted on Facebook, hoping someone out there had seen them. A photo of the couple smiling beneath a Joshua tree made the rounds. A GoFundMe launched. Volunteers started searching on foot, tracing possible desert routes. Still, nothing. The desert doesn't give up its secrets easily. Days stretched into unease. Theories bloomed. Some said they got stuck and tried to hike out. Others whispered about cults, sinkholes, hidden bunkers. The kind of desert legends that sound ridiculous until someone you love disappears into the same dust. By the end of the week, all that remained were questions. 2 people, 1 Jeep, and a stretch of land that swallows sound, signal, and everything else. Jason and Melissa had not returned. And now, no one could say if they ever would. They started looking on Thursday morning. Local rangers from the Mojave National Preserve gathered just after sunrise, armed with printed maps, GPS trackers, and a description of a silver Jeep Cherokee carrying 2 campers last seen in Barstow. The call came from San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, a couple in their early 30s, missing since Saturday, believed to be somewhere near the preserve. They hadn't returned. No cell signal. No known destination, just a vague trail of digital crumbs. Ranger Lucas Brent had seen this before. People underestimate the desert. Its openness feels freeing until it doesn't. Then it becomes a maze of heat and silence. By 10 a.m., the sun was already high, casting harsh shadows across the cracked terrain. Teams fanned out from key entry points Kelbaker Road, Sema Dome, Ivanpahan focused on the areas where unpaved roads veer off into nowhere. Helicopters swept overhead, slow and methodical. From the sky, the Mojave looks endless waves of brown and gold, dotted with dry creosote and pale, jagged rock. A jeep in that sea would be like a dropped coin in a football field. They checked campsites, desert watering holes, abandoned mining roads. Nothing. No tire tracks, no debris, no sign of recent activity. The wind had cleared most of the ground. What little evidence might have existed had already been erased. By late afternoon, heat shimmered on the horizon. A ranger stumbled on an empty fire, ring-charred wood cold and brittle, but the tracks around it were old. Someone had camped there once. Not recently, not them. Back at the ranger station, they reviewed drone footage. Blurred ridgelines, dry washes, the occasional half-buried trailer. Still nothing. No movement, no vehicle, no couple. The search radius widened. Jason and Melissa's names were now entered into the missing persons database. Rangers began checking with BLM staff, backcountry guides, even off-grid regulars known to wander that region. No one had seen them. The desert was silent. And silence in the Mojave is never just quiet. It's total, absolute. Like it's waiting for something to be found, or not found at all. By sundown, the team returned with dust on their boots, and nothing else. The desert had spoken. It said nothing. They found the jeep on Friday afternoon. It was parked just off a dry service road about 12 miles southeast of Amboy, half hidden behind a low ridge. Not stuck, not crashed, just sitting still and dusty, like it had been there for days. The wheels were coated in sand. No recent tread marks. The hood warm from the sun, not from any engine heat. There were no visible dents, no shattered glass, no blood. The driver's side door was locked. So was the passenger side. Through the windows, rangers saw 2 backpacks in the back seat, a Polaroid camera on the dash, and a pair of hiking boots tucked neatly near the floorboard. Nothing about it felt rushed. Nothing about it felt wrong until you realized what was missing. The keys were inside, resting in the center console. No wallet, no phones, no water bottles in reach. Just absence. The rangers circled the jeep, eyes scanning the sand for clues, but the ground was bare. No footprints, no drag marks, no signs of a struggle, not even animal tracks. It was as if the couple had stepped out and disappeared into thin air. One ranger found a trailhead marker nearby faded, sun-bleached. It hadn't been maintained in years. The trail itself, if you could call it that, barely existed. A few rocks, a worn patch of earth. And beyond that, nothing but desert. The heat hovered around 102 degrees. The kind of heat that dries your mouth in minutes and cooks electronics in your pack. If Jason and Melissa had walked out there unprepared, it wouldn't have taken long. But if they did, why didn't they leave a note? Why leave the car locked? Why take nothing? The jeep was towed for inspection. Investigators combed through it inch by inch. There was no foul play, no sign of forced entry, no malfunctions. The gas tank was half full. It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice. The desert doesn't lie. It doesn't need to. It just waits. And now it waited with something new. A vehicle abandoned without reason. 2 people missing without a trace. The jeep was dust-covered but intact, parked like someone meant to return. Investigators opened the doors with gloves on, careful not to disturb whatever story might still be waiting inside. The air was stale but dry. No smell of rot, no mess, just silence. On the passenger seat sat Melissa's canvas hiking bag, zipped halfway open. Inside, her wallet. ID, a few bills, 3 faded receipt sewn from a gas station in Barstow. Next to it, Jason's wallet, wedged beneath a notebook filled with packing lists and gas mileage scribbles. Between the seats, a worn map folded unevenly, the kind sold at dusty ranger stations and truck stops. Sections were highlighted in blue pen campgrounds, scenic overlooks, long stretches of forgotten highway. But one mark stood out, a thick red X drawn near the bottom corner, where no trail or site was labeled. Just open land, no notation, no explanation. They spread the map on the Jeep's hood, trying to triangulate the location. The X was nowhere near the path they'd taken. It was out past any marked road, beyond even the dry lake beds and rusted signs. A place with no name. The real surprise was the camera. A black Nikon point-and-shoot sat beneath the driver's seat, battery still inside, lens cap off. They scrolled through the memory card. Dozens of images, Jason behind the wheel, Melissa holding a thermos, sunrise over the Mojave, then landscapes, endless rock, blinding sun, creosote stretching into forever. A few selfies, both of them smiling, dusty, golden lit. But toward the end, the images changed. The last 4 were different. One showed a flat patch of land, no trail, no sign, just an expanse of cracked desert. Another showed what looked like a rusted vent, maybe from an old structure half buried in sand. The third was blurry, off-angle, as if taken in a rush. And the final image, the sky, cloudless, a sliver of Melissa's face in the corner, her expression unreadable. No timestamp past Saturday evening. The Jeep was a capsule, frozen in time, nothing stolen, nothing broken, no struggle. Just 2 lives paused mid-sentence, their last chapter waiting somewhere beyond that red X. The Jeep was found 18 miles from the nearest marked trail. Not a road, not a turnout. Just an old service path, more rock than dirt, barely wide enough for tires. Rangers said the track hadn't been maintained in over a decade. It wasn't on most maps anymore. The only people who used it were power company workers checking abandoned Lincer people who didn't know better. But Jason and Melissa weren't careless. They were planners. The kind who made lists, checked distances, packed extra batteries. So why had they driven so far off the grid? The map offered one clue. That red X hovered over a section of land known locally as Split Ridge Basin, an unregulated stretch between 2 dry lake beds. The area had no water, no facilities, no camping designation. Just miles of scorched earth and whispers of Cold War bunkers long buried beneath the sand. Investigators plotted the Jeep's route: Barstow, gas station, then the turnoff past Ludlow, south, then southeast, following that service road until it disappeared. From there, it was guesswork. Tracks faded quickly. Wind covered the rest. What was out there? Locals had their theories. Some mentioned a sealed fallout shelter built in the 1960s, decommissioned and forgotten. Others spoke of survivalists who used the area for off-grid living. No power, no laws, no visitors. The odd thing was how intentional it all seemed. The Jeep wasn't stuck. There was no crash, no signs of panic. They had enough fuel to get back, and yet they didn't. Instead, they drove to a place no one goes on accident. The terrain past the Jeep's location grows worse as soft sand, brittle brush, jagged rock. You don't hike that in sneakers. You don't wander that for fun. The red X on the map wasn't near anything worth seeing. No overlook, no trail marker. It pointed to nothing. Or maybe to something only they knew about. A theory began to form that sounded less like a search and rescue case and more like a riddle. What if they weren't lost? What if they went there on purpose? Because the desert doesn't just confuse people. Sometimes it calls them. And Jason and Melissa had answered. It was the 5th to last photo that stopped everyone. The image was grainy, overexposed at the edges, the result of desert glare on an old digital camera. But in the center half, buried in dust and cracked earth, was something that didn't belong. A metal hatch. Circular, bolted down, faded warning labels flaking off its rusted surface, and just beside it, a short steel vent protruding from the ground like the snout of something long asleep. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Investigators stared at it on the monitor, zooming in, enhancing contrast. One label, barely visible, read, "Property of U.S. Civil Defense," the kind of tag used during the Cold War. But there were no known fallout shelters mapped in that area. No records, no reason for it to exist. The location matched the red X on their map. Satellite images of the region showed nothing. No disturbance, no man-made structures. But the desert has a way of hiding things in plain sight. Sand drifts, rock piles, shadows that erase detail. Search teams were dispatched. They followed the GPS coordinates from the photo, pushing through brittle shrubs and searing heat. But when they arrived, there was nothing. Just endless beige, no hatch, no vent, no trace of what had been captured in that final image. They searched in a wide circle 50 yards, then 100. Drones scanned overhead. Ground-penetrating radar passed through layers of silence. Still, nothing. One ranger said the hatch reminded him of a decommissioned bunker he'd seen in Arizona. Another said it looked too clean, too staged. Maybe it wasn't real. Maybe the camera had glitched. Maybe it was a prank or a mirage or a trick of the light. But the timestamp was real. The angle of the sun matched the time of day. Jason or Melissa had taken that photo on Saturday evening. And then, nothing. That image became the last known clue in a trail that had already faded. A hatch to nowhere, a vent from nothing. But more than anything, it raised the one question that no one could stop asking. If the hatch was real, did they go inside? After the hatch photo, the trail ended. Search teams swept the region for 2 more weeks. Volunteers, dogs, drones, even thermal scanners. They combed washes, checked crevices, circled every possible shelter or cave. They followed dry creek beds and scaled ridgelines. But the desert gave back nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no torn fabric snagged on mesquite, no bones. The jeep was impounded, examined, tested, nothing suspicious. No fingerprints, except Jason's and Melissa's. No blood, no damage. It was a vehicle parked by people who expected to return. The digital camera was sent to a forensic lab. The final 5 images were authentic. No edits, no metadata tampering. The last image was of that hatch, time-stamped 5:14 p.m. on Saturday. After that, the memory card went dark. Not corrupted, just unused. The families held out hope for weeks, then months. Sarah printed missing posters, handed them to gas station clerks and roadside diners. Melissa's mother sat by the phone every night, answering every unknown number with shaking hands. Jason's brother went quiet, deleted social media, stopped answering calls. Friends held vigils, lit candles, left their favorite snacks at the trailhead where the jeep had been found. In San Diego, their apartment sat frozen plants slowly dying, their cat rehomed, the coffee mugs still waiting in the sink. Every theory was explored: abduction, environmental accident, voluntary disappearance, cults, military testing. One Reddit thread suggested the couple found a sealed Cold War shelter and died inside after the hatch locked shut. But without evidence, all anyone had were stories. And grief doesn't care for theories. By the end of that year, the official investigation was downgraded to inactive. No new leads, no sightings, no updates. Only 2 people gone and a desert full of silence. Melissa's voicemail still played when you called. Jason's Instagram, untouched, still showed their last hike at Joshua Tree. People moved on. But their absence remained like a bruise under the skin deep, invisible, aching. Because sometimes people vanish in ways that leave behind no questions. But Jason and Melissa didn't vanish quietly. They vanished with a trail that made no sense, and a photo that should not exist. From 2010 to 2016, the desert grew quiet again. The official case was cold. Search teams had moved on. Files were archived. But for those who knew Jason and Melissa, those who couldn't let go, Mojave never stopped whispering. Every so often, someone would try again. A new ranger, a curious hiker, a search dog brought in unofficially. They'd follow the same maps, revisit the old service roads, squint into the horizon, hoping to catch a glint of metal, a scrap of fabric, a sign. But every trip ended the same way, empty hands and tired eyes. Nothing left but footprints blowing away in the wind. Melissa's sister, Sarah, went out there twice a year, always alone, always with the map. She'd trace her fingers to the red X and say it out loud like it was a prayer. The location still didn't make sense. It wasn't a view, it wasn't a destination, but she kept returning to it, the way someone keeps reading the last sentence of a book, hoping the ending might change. Online, forums bloomed with speculation. Amateur detectives pored over satellite images, cross-referenced declassified military grids, and tried to enhance the final photo from the digital camera, stretching pixels into possibilities. They called themselves the Hatch Watchers. Some were serious, methodical, others spiraled fast. A subreddit popped up in 2013. R. Desert Vault. Hundreds joined, then thousands. Photos of Cold War infrastructure were posted daily. Desert vents, old radiation shelters, unexplained metal structures. Most had answers, a few didn't. People claimed they had found similar hatches. Some said they'd heard vibrations underground. Others said nothing at all but posted grainy photos with coordinates. But every claim led to dead ends. The hatch in the photo was never found. No matching structure was logged in Mojave databases. No footprints ever led in or out. The desert doesn't forget, it just waits. And from 2010 to 2016, that patch of land between the dry lake beds held its secrets close. 2 people had disappeared into the silence. And still, something about it didn't feel finished. It started with whispers. Then it took on a life of its own. Jason and Melissa's disappearance became internet folklore, part tragedy, part enigma, part obsession. On message boards and conspiracy podcasts, the theories grew more elaborate. Each thread spun further from the last. The simplest was a survivalist tale. They found a Cold War shelter and tried to explore. The hatch sealed behind them. They died inside, waiting for a rescue that never came. It explained the final photo. The red X, the careful parking of the Jeep. But if that were true, why hadn't anyone found the shelter? Others believed it wasn't chance they were lured. Theories pointed to desert cults, off-grid communes known for isolation and silence. Some locals remembered rumors of a group operating in the 80s out by Split Ridge. No electricity, no paper trails, just beliefs. The kind of place where strangers weren't welcomed, they were swallowed. Military cover-up was next. Theories suggested an underground base used for weapons testing or classified research. Some claimed the hatch wasn't a fallout shelter at all, but an airlock, a portal, something not meant to be opened. They cited blacked-out sections on old Mojave maps, unmarked roads, aircraft that flew at night with no lights. Even the shape of the hatch looked wrong, they said, more industrial than civilian, too clean, too deliberate. Then came the wild ones. UFO enthusiasts claimed the couple had encountered something extraterrestrial, that the hatch wasn't built by humans, that the red X was a marker not for people, but for something watching. They dissected Melissa's final photo, claiming distortions in the sky, a shimmer, a blur, a shape. Jason's final Instagram post was reanalyzed hundreds of times, a Joshua tree in the background. Comments picked apart like sacred text. One said, "Off-grid soon, radio silence ahead." That became fuel. A dozen threads broke off from that single line. Most people didn't believe the stranger theories, but they read them, they watched the videos, they clicked. Because something about Jason and Melissa's story wouldn't let go. It wasn't just the silence, it was the intention. The feeling that whatever happened out there didn't happen by accident. And in a world built on patterns, their vanishing refused to fit any. Ask around long enough in the Mojave, and you'll hear them. Stories whispered over beers in dusty bars and passed between generations like family heirlooms. Stories about hidden doors in rock walls, about chain-link fences with no roads leading to them, about buildings that vanish from satellite view, then reappear a month later. The desert keeps things, not just bones and rusted cars, but memories, structures, secrets. Old-timers in Amboy and Baker still talk about the Cold War days when the government carved bunkers into mountainsides and buried fallout shelters miles from anything, just in case. Some were sealed up, some were forgotten. A few, they say, were never meant to be found again. Truckers tell of strange lights that skim the ridgelines at night, low hums that vibrate through the air without warning. One man swore he saw a door open in the ground once, out past Cadiz Road, and something metallic rise for a moment before sliding back under the sand. He stopped telling that story when people laughed too loud. Desert wanderers, the kind who live out of vans and haven't had cell service in years, speak differently. Not afraid, but aware. They say there are places out there where compasses stop working, where birds don't fly overhead, where it feels wrong to step, like you're trespassing somewhere ancient. The red X on Jason and Melissa's map sits in one of those places. No power lines, no water sources, no trails, just heat and silence and miles of untouched earth. But that hasn't stopped people from wondering if something lies beneath it, a remnant of a different time, a facility not listed on maps, a project that was buried deeper than anyone knew. Some think the couple stumbled onto one of those places. Others think they were led there. The camera photoed the vent. The hatch looked too intentional, too precise to be coincidence. Whatever it wasn't made for tourists. But the Mojave won't confirm or deny anything. It never does. It just waits, burying the truth under time, dust, and sun. If there was a shelter, it's been swallowed. And the desert isn't interested in giving it back. Sarah's life split the day the call came in. First, she waited. Then she searched. Then she changed. At first, she believed what the rangers told her. Maybe they got lost. Maybe they'd turn up at a gas station, dusty and embarrassed. Maybe they were camping off-grid longer than expected. She told herself those things every hour, on repeat. But by week 2, something inside her broke. Not with grief, but with certainty. She knew Melissa wouldn't disappear without a trace. Not without letting someone know. Not without a plan. Jason, either. They were too careful, too deliberate. So she started digging. At night, she combed through Jason's digital footprint. Hacked into old accounts, traced IPs, messaged friends he hadn't spoken to in years. She filed FOIA requests. Printed topographic maps. Watched drone footage of the Mojave like it was a movie she'd already seen but didn't understand yet. She went out there, alone. Twice a year. Sometimes more. She'd fly into San Diego, rent a car, and drive east until the road dissolved into gravel. She'd bring a tent, water, first aid, a shovel, the map. She'd camp near the place the Jeep was found, hike toward where the red X pointed. The terrain changed every time. Rock slides, wind-blown patterns, animal tracks that went nowhere. She'd whisper Melissa's name into the stillness, like it could pull something to the surface. People told her to move on. Therapists, friends, co-workers, even her parents stopped calling as much. But she couldn't stop, not when the final photo existed. Not when a hatch that shouldn't be there had been captured by someone she loved. Sometimes she'd stand alone under the Mojave stars, phone in hand, staring at that image, the vent, the hatch. Melissa's face barely visible in the corner. She would ask the desert aloud, "Where did you take her?" There was never an answer, but that never stopped her. Because Sarah wasn't searching for closure. She was searching for truth. And somewhere beneath sand, silence, and maybe concrete, she believed the truth was still waiting. Just like Melissa. It started with a username, GravSpec74, a faceless Reddit account, active mostly in obscure survival threads and Cold War forums, who one day posted something that made the hatch watchers freeze. It was a high-res scan of Jason and Melissa's recovered map, overlaid with a declassified satellite image from 1,000 986 part of a series once buried in the Defense Mapping Agency archives. The overlay was meticulous, lined up using riverbeds, fault lines, and even weathered elevation markers still faintly visible on the paper map. The red X, it turned out, wasn't random. It sat almost directly on top of a faded square labeled Alpha 7. No legend, no context, just a box, long since scrubbed from public maps. The coordinates aligned with an area where military reconnaissance had once flagged subsurface anomalies, whatever that meant. Other users jumped in. A retired Army cartographer confirmed that Alpha-named sites were often tied to test ranges bunkers, signal stations, hardened shelters. One theory said Alpha 7 was a fallout monitoring point. Another claimed it was a closed weapons storage cache used during Cuban Missile Crisis drills. But no record of decommissioning ever surfaced. No closure report, just a line that existed then disappeared. The hatch photo resurfaced in the comments, enhanced and filtered. Users compared bolt patterns, suggested it wasn't civilian-grade steel. Some believed the vent was a disguised intake system. Others pointed to shadows in the photo's cornera shape behind Melissa, maybe or maybe not. It didn't matter if they were right. The point had been made. Jason and Melissa hadn't just wandered. They had a destination. And the red X was no coincidence. It wasn't a mark for a campsite. It was a location tied to something no longer meant to be found. Within days, GravSpec 74 deleted their account. No explanation, no trace. But the file spread. The overlay made its way into digital archives, videos, forums. Sarah saw it too. She printed it, folded it into her notebook, because the question had shifted. Not just what the red X pointed to, but who had known it was there, and why Jason and Melissa had marked it at all. It was buried, deep, almost missed entirely. In 2016, a retired tech analyst named Ron Claver requested access to the impounded Jeep's onboard navigation system under California's Public Records Act. He wasn't an investigator. He wasn't even from the area. He just followed the case like a riddle he couldn't stop solving. What he got back was a mess of encrypted log files, corrupted timestamps, and miles of dead-end code. But Ron knew what to look for. Using vehicle diagnostic software and a patchwork of open-source decryption tools, he pulled fragments of the Jeep's internal route history coordinates meant for service logs, never visible to the average driver. Hidden beneath system resets and error reports was a list of failed routes, scraps of GPS data that had been overridden but not fully deleted. One string of numbers stood out: 34.8159 degrees N, 115.6714 degrees W. He mapped it immediately. The pin landed almost exactly where the red X sat on the physical map. But this wasn't just any coordinate, it was recorded as a destination input. Jason or Melissa had manually entered it into the Jeep's system. Not a road, not a park, not a trailhead, a raw coordinate, one that led to open desert. Why? No one drives into the Mojave and types numbers like that into a GPS unless they know something, unless someone gave it to them. Ron cross-checked it with publicly available satellite data. What he found was strange and unbroken pattern of square disturbance in the terrain. Not natural, not recent. It was just large enough to be a structure buried, maybe, covered, but real. He submitted his findings to the San Bernardino Sheriff's Office. They acknowledged receipt, nothing more. The official stance hadn't changed. No new evidence, no active search. But Sarah saw the report when someone sent it to her inbox at 2 a.m. No subject line, just the PDF. She stared at the coordinates, memorized them. She printed them, traced them, whispered them like a name. Because this wasn't a theory. This was data. Jason and Melissa hadn't stumbled into the unknown. They'd been looking for it. And now, for the first time in years, there was something concrete. A set of numbers that might lead to the truth, or to where it was buried. It didn't take long for the internet to latch onto it. After the GPS coordinates were leaked and the map overlay began circulating, conspiracy forums ignited, theories stacked on theories. but one rose above the rest, clean, terrifying, and almost believable. A Cold War fallout shelter. The idea had always hovered in the background, whispered in old Mojave bars and mentioned in Jason's final Reddit posts. But now it had weight, evidence, a destination on the Jeep system. A photo of a hatch, a red X marking a precise point on an outdated map. Forum users compiled government documents from the 50s and 60s, decommissioned bunker projects, civil defense shelter inventories. Some recalled Project Greek Island, others referenced Raven Rock. Hidden infrastructure wasn't a fantasy, it was policy. The U.S. built hundreds of these sites, some beneath schools, others in deserts. What if one of them was still intact? They called it Site Echo. Thread after thread tried to reverse engineer the hatch from Melissa's photo. Users claimed the bolt pattern matched that of Model 42C blast doors used in early prototype bunkers. Others swore they could see the edge of a keypad, sand-worn and cracked. One claimed he'd heard of a shelter out there from his grandfather, who worked in missile telemetry during the Cold War. And if there was a shelter, they asked, who was it for? Why hadn't it been uncovered? And most importantly, was it ever meant to be found again? Theories spiraled quickly. Maybe Jason and Melissa had gone looking for it. Maybe someone had told them where to find it. Maybe they weren't alone when they arrived. A few said the hatch locked from the outside. Others insisted it was sealed decades ago and never reopened until the Harts tried to get in. No one could agree on what happened, but the details no longer felt random. They felt chosen. The vent, the hatch, the X, the coordinates. Not accidents, invitations. And suddenly the question changed again. It wasn't just where did Jason and Melissa go. It was who built the place they might have found. And why no one had ever come back out. It started with a single podcast episode. Title, The Hatch in the Desert. Posted by a small investigative series called Obscura Signal, known for cold cases, deep dives, and eerie tone. The episode was quietly uploaded one Friday morning in late 2018. No fanfare, no sponsors. But within 72 hours, it was everywhere. The host, a former crime reporter named Elise Durant, walked listeners through the entire Hart disappearance point by point. She used public records, Sarah's own interviews, the leaked coordinates, and the infamous final photo. The pacing was slow, deliberate, the kind that lets silence echo louder than words. Then she played the audio. A scratchy clip from Melissa's last voicemail to Sarah, recorded just hours before the Barstow gas station. Wind noise. Then Melissa's voice, calm but thin. "We're almost there," she said. "It's strange out here, quiet, like nothing wants to move." Elise let the tape linger. Then she explained the theory Site Echo, the fallout shelter, the overlapping coordinates, the Cold War secrecy. She brought in a retired Army engineer who spoke anonymously, claiming bunkers without public closure records often meant reclassification, not destruction. "They're not erased," he said. "They're buried." The episode trended on Twitter by Monday. By Tuesday, the Hatch Watchers subreddit doubled in size. By Wednesday, news outlets picked it up. Desert disappearance mystery reignites online. Listeners posted their own theories. A TikTok series recreated the timeline with animated maps. People began planning trips to the Mojave, hoping to find the hatch with drones, metal detectors, or raw instinct. But not everyone was pleased. Sarah received anonymous messages telling her to stop talking. Her car was broken into, nothing stolen, just her glove box open and the map copy missing. She knew it was a warning. Still, she didn't stop. Because the podcast did something the authorities hadn't in nearly a decade. It made people care again. Jason and Melissa's names were back in the public eye. Their story wasn't just a mystery anymore, it was a movement. A rally cry for those who believe some places are forgotten on purpose. The desert had stayed quiet for too long. And now, finally, someone was listening. His name was Caleb Morton. 54, divorced, former military contractor turned solo adventurer. He spent most of his retirement trekking through forgotten parts of the Southwest, mapping ghost towns and tracking old missile sites. Not for work, not for glory, just because some people don't do well in cities. When Obscura Signal released its episode on the Hart disappearance, Caleb was already 3 days into a trip through the Mojave. He listened to the podcast while sitting beside a dry wash, campfire crackling, sky bleeding stars. By the next morning, he had downloaded every available topographic file he could find. He wasn't chasing ghosts. He hated theories. What interested him was precision, the kind that came from matching flawed government maps to the real world and watching them collapse. The coordinates mentioned in the episode, the spot marked by the red X, they didn't align perfectly with known shelter locations, but they were close to something. He felt it. Back home in Flagstaff, Caleb pulled up declassified aerial scans from the late 80s, a few files from an old Army colleague, and compared them with current satellite overlays. There was a square disturbance barely visible, but too geometric to ignore sitting in the same quadrant the Harts had pinned. He built a plan. 2 drones, solar charger, 5 gallons of water, 1 Beretta M9, just in case. By mid-August 2018, Caleb was back in the Mojave. He didn't tell anyone. He drove his truck to the edge of Cadiz Dunes, hiked 5 miles into no man's land, and launched the drone just after sunrise. What he saw on the feed made him stop breathing for a moment. A flat patch, no vegetation, a shape just beneath the dust, too smooth, too intentional. He hiked toward it with a shovel strapped to his back and half a dozen GPS points saved to his wristwatch. The air was dry, dead, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. And then, with the sun low behind him, he felt it. A hollow thunk beneath his boot. He knelt, brushed away the sand. It was metal, painted, bolted, and cold. He wasn't looking for Jason and Melissa, but he had just found what they might have died trying to reach. It took him an hour to clear enough of the surface to see it. The hatch was circular 4 feet across, steel-plated, scorched at the edges. A rusted handle sat at the center, surrounded by 6 recessed bolts, flush with the concrete lip that framed it. On the left side, a sun-faded triangle was barely visible beneath the dust. Yellow. Black. The universal radiation symbol. Caleb didn't move for a long time. He was trained for this kind of thing: chemical seals, blast-resistant doors, Cold War artifacts, but something about the hatch felt wrong. It wasn't just old, it was sealed, purposefully. The kind of seal made by someone who wanted to keep whatever was inside exactly where it was. He tapped on the steel. Hollow echo. He took photos, wide angles, close-ups, a video sweep from his phone. Then he paced the perimeter. The ground was firm, no signs of recent disturbance, no tire tracks. But 30 feet out, half buried in the slope, he found what looked like ventilation piping. Thin, corroded, running straight down into the dirt. He didn't try to open the hatch. The bolts hadn't been touched in years. The seal had turned reddish-black, like it had fused with time. Even if he wanted to force it, it would have taken tools he didn't carry. Still, he stayed near it overnight. Pitched a tarp in the windbreak behind a rock wall and watched the moon slide over the land. There were no sounds, no animals. Even the wind felt muffled. The next morning he marked the site on his GPS and hiked back out. He didn't call the authorities. He didn't call the podcast. He sent the coordinates to one person, Sarah Hartalong, with 4 photos and a note. "I think I found what your sister was looking for. It's sealed, looks military, but it's there." Sarah didn't reply right away. But when she did, it was only one line. "Do you think they went in?" Caleb stared at the hatch photo on his phone for a long time before answering. "I don't think they found it. I think it was waiting for them." It took 6 days to get the right people to listen. Sarah forwarded Caleb's photos to the Mojave National Preserve office, then to the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. At first, they dismissed it, said it was likely an old mining utility cap or a decommissioned weather station, but the radiation symbol changed things. Quietly, an unmarked team was dispatched. No press. No announcement. Just two black SUVs and a utility truck heading east, deep into the desert. They found the hatch exactly where Caleb said it would be. Dust still brushed back, bolts exposed, concrete lip cracked from years of desert heat and wind. They circled it for hours, unsure how to proceed. Then, late on a Tuesday afternoon in August 2018, the seal was breached. A torch was used to cut through the most rusted bolts. It hissed, spat, then gave. The final pop echoed across the flatness like a gunshot. Then came the groan, the slow creak of steel grinding against itself, resisting the pull of the outside world. When the hatch opened, it exhaled. A low hiss of air escaped, stale and heavy. Not foul, but still wrong air that hadn't moved in decades. One ranger described it like a basement that had forgotten what light was. They lowered a probe first, then a ladder. Oxygen levels were low but stable. What lay below was narrow, a single shaft dropping 12 feet into a small chamber. Concrete walls, reinforced, a steel door, half ajar at the bottom, and behind it, darkness. When flashlights flicked on, they caught shapes boxes, shelves, canvas. Shadows frozen in place, waiting. The space wasn't large, maybe 20 by 20 feet. A survival chamber, not a base, not a bunker, a capsule. The air inside was colder than expected, dry, preserved. And near the back wall, beneath an old civil defense poster curled by time, was something no one was ready for. A cot. And on it, two forms. Still, side by side, wrapped in dust and silence. What began as a theory had just become real. And now, the heart case was no longer a disappearance. It was a crime scene. They stood side by side, just as they'd lived. Jason and Melissa Hart lay on a steel-framed cot, still and skeletal. Their remains partially covered with faded wool blankets stamped with U.S. Civil Defense logos. Their fingers were laced together, brittle and bone-white. No signs of trauma, no signs of struggle, just quiet. The room looked like it hadn't been touched since the late 60s. Along the walls were ration tins labeled in English and Cyrillic, fallout shelter supplies stacked in military crates, a lantern, a dented water canister, one cot, one desk, one vent system running overhead. Every corner spoke of paranoia and preparation. The Cold War had left its fingerprint resealed, preserved, and utterly forgotten. Authorities cataloged everything: serial numbers, dust layers, air samples. The shelter wasn't in any federal archive. No ownership, no record of its construction. It didn't exist until now. There were notebooks, too. Old field logs from the 60s filled with supply counts and handwritten maintenance entries. But among them, a spiral-bound journal with a cracked green cover. The handwriting was newer, slanted, familiar. Melissa's. She had documented the first days inside. We're okay. Hatch sealed behind us. It wasn't supposed to lock. Jason says it'll be okay. We have food, water, but no signal. It's colder than we thought. The last entry was dated 6 days after they entered. We rationed. We waited. Still no sound. Still no one. Maybe the desert swallowed us. Or maybe this place was meant to. I don't know what we found. Only that we shouldn't have gone in. No more entries followed. The digital camera was there too. The same one found in the Jeep, its memory card now strangely full again. New photos, grainy images of the hatch interior, Jason sealing the door, Melissa lying on the cot, notebooks spread on the floor. It told a story in frames. They hadn't been dragged inside. They had chosen it. Maybe out of curiosity. Maybe out of fear. Maybe because they thought it was safer than what waited outside. The shelter had kept them intact. Time hadn't taken them. The desert hadn't taken them. They had waited, together, for someone to open the hatch. And now, finally, someone had. The process was clinical, but the confirmation hit like thunder. Dental records were the first step. Melissa's matched almost immediately. A molar crown noted in her last dental visit. Jason's took longer, but the spacing of his lower incisors lined up with records pulled from his old Navy file. DNA came next. Bone samples, swabbed and sent to a lab in Sacramento. The results returned in 5 days. Both were a match. Jason and Melissa Hart had been found. Officially, the Hart case was closed, but nothing about it felt resolved. The press released a brief statement to missing hikers located in a sealed Cold War-era fallout shelter. No signs of foul play, no indication of why they entered. The term accidental entrapment was floated. But people who followed the case knew better. This wasn't just a wrong turn. This wasn't just survival gone bad. Sarah didn't cry when she got the call. She thanked the officer, hung up, then sat on her kitchen floor for an hour, holding the printed map with the red X, running her thumb over it like a scar. They'd been under the ground the whole time, 10 years, less than 20 miles from where the Jeep was found, preserved by concrete and silence. The items recovered from the shelter were transferred to evidence: Melissa's journal, Jason's boots, the camera, and a half-dozen documents from the metal desk in the corner. Most were water-damaged or brittle, but one notebook survived intact. The writing inside didn't belong to either of them. That detail came later. For now, the world paused. The couple who vanished had been real. Their love, their fear, their final choice to step into something buried in the sand, it wasn't fiction. It was dust-covered truth. Found in the shape of 2 skeletons lying quietly on a cot, their hands still touching like they were waiting for the sound of a latch or a voice or rescue. Jason and Melissa weren't lost anymore. They'd been found. But the questions they left behind had only just begun. Because within the shelter, amid all the rusted supplies and cold air, was a trace of someone else. Someone who hadn't been in the story until now. The notebook was standard military issue, black cover, squared corners, yellowed edges. It was found tucked beneath a stack of maps in the shelter's corner filing bin, wedged deep enough to avoid the worst of the moisture and dust. At first glance, it looked like maintenance log entries dated sporadically between 1981 and 1994. Notes about generator checks, canned food inventories, air filter cycles. Most of it was routine, boring. Then the tone shifted. Around page 46, the handwriting changed tighter, more frantic. Phrases circled, words crossed out. Strange notations in the margins. The dates became irregular. One page simply read, "They told me this place was off the books, but it was never supposed to be forgotten." Then, "Radiation test negative, but the signal keeps coming. Low-frequency pulses, once a day, 300 hours." Further in, the entries took a darker turn. "The door seals, and it doesn't open from the inside. No one told me that. No one said I'd be alone." There were sketches, crude diagrams of what looked like underground piping. One page showed concentric circles with jagged arrows pointing outward, labeled feedback loop and entry signal. At the end of the notebook, 3 pages stood out. The first read, "They were here, a man and a woman. They thought it was shelter, but it's not. It never was." The next, "They didn't scream. They just stayed, like the place wanted them to." And finally, a signature, AT. No name, no rank, no record in the shelter, no trace in military archives. But now, someone else was part of the story. AT, whoever they were, had been inside before Jason and Melissa. Maybe long before, maybe not. No one knew. The writing gave no origin, no exit, only a presence, a voice. Had AT been watching? Had they left before the couple entered? Or had they never left at all? Investigators searched the shelter again. Every bolt, every vent. No second body, no hidden compartment. Just the words, just the warning. The final truth might never be known. But Melissa's last journal entry now echoed with something new. "I don't know what we found, only that we shouldn't have gone in." And maybe, just maybe, they hadn't been alone. When the forensics team finished their sweep, the results were inconclusive. There was no sign of forced entry, The hatch had been locked from the inside, the seal intact, the bolts untouched until Caleb arrived nearly a decade later. Nothing suggested a struggle. No trauma to the bones, no blood, no signs of poison, just two skeletons, side by side, preserved by cold air and stillness. Toxicology was useless. Too much time had passed, but there was no trace of violence, no clear explanation for why they died. The ration tins had been opened, water consumed. The lantern burned out with its wick half used. They'd lived in the shelter for a time, days, maybe weeks, long enough to lose hope. And yet, something didn't sit right. The steel hatch, once closed, had no internal release. The interior locking bar wasn't designed to reopen from within. A flaw? A feature? No one could say. But once that door shut, there was no getting out. So the question rose, did they know that? Had Jason and Melissa entered the shelter thinking it was refuge? Or had they been misled? Sarah was the first to ask what everyone else tiptoed around. What if someone told them about it, she asked. What if they didn't find it by chance? The red X on the map. The GPS coordinate manually entered. Melissa's final photo taken just outside the hatch. Jason's last Instagram post. Off-grid soon, radio silence ahead. They weren't wandering. They were heading somewhere. Someone had to point them there. And if someone did, why? People on the forums debated endlessly. One group argued they were trapped unknowingly, sealing themselves into a Cold War tomb. Others said it was symbolic, a final act by two people obsessed with the past. But a third theory emerged, darker, more deliberate, that they were led there, not by curiosity, but by design. Led into a sealed box in the middle of nowhere, locked in by architecture, by history, by whoever or whatever had left that hatch untouched for decades. Jason and Melissa weren't lost in the wilderness. They were delivered to a place that wasn't built to protect, but to contain. The report came from an old mechanic outside Amboy. Just a few days after the shelter story hit the local news, he called the Mojave tip line and left a message. I think I saw him back in 9 or maybe 10. Don't know if it matters now. He didn't say much, just bought water, duct tape, and a topographic map, paid cash. Had this stare like he'd already been underground for weeks. Other calls followed. A retired park ranger remembered a man camping illegally off Black Rock Canyon Road 2 close to a restricted sector, a loner. Drove a beat-up Cherokee, always wore long sleeves, carried notebooks. Then came the most compelling tip from a motel clerk in Needles. She swore he checked in twice that summer, always asked for a room facing the back lot. Didn't want housekeeping, paid with crumpled 20s, gave a name the second time, Alan T. A.T. No one could find a record of him, no social, no license, no military ID, just a pattern vanishing footprints across the edge of the Mojave, and then silence. Who was he? Was A.T. the one who left the notebook in the shelter? The one who wrote about the signal, about being sealed in, about the couple that followed? Had he lived down there, or simply passed through? More chilling still, had he sent Jason and Melissa there? Theories swirled. Some said A.T. was a rogue contractor, someone who knew about forgotten facilities. Others suggested he had nothing to do with them, that Jason and Melissa simply stumbled into a myth he tried to document. But one idea refused to die. That A.T. had been watching, that he'd met the Harts, talked with them, maybe even handed them the coordinate. Maybe he thought he was giving them a gift-tan escape from the world, a quiet place far from everything. Maybe he never expected them to go inside. Or maybe he did. No one's seen A.T. since 2009. But some claim he still walks the outer Mojave, a shadow on the edge of heat waves. A figure seen just before dusk, gone by dawn. No proof, no trail. Just a name in a notebook, a stranger's signature, and two people who followed it straight into silence. The deeper investigators dug into the shelter, the clearer it became this wasn't an accident of history, it was a plan. Along the far wall, behind a loose concrete panel, they They found a stash of provisions buried beneath a tarp and marked with faded stencils, CDNY, 2001. Inside, dozens of canned goods, most expired around the turn of the century. Labels curling, contents solidified, but they were organized, stacked, categorized by type. Next to them were two still-sealed water filtration units wrapped in plastic, tagged with serial numbers from a long-defunct survivalist supplier. It wasn't just food, it was preparation. Someone had readied the bunker not just for survival but for occupation. A makeshift desk near the vent system held reams of paper, mostly unreadable. One sheet had calculations, water rations, sleep cycles. Another had daily schedules, but the ink had run in the corners. It was the chest that changed everything. Tucked behind the cot, locked, heavy, metal. It took bolt cutters to pry open. Inside was a mix of items that didn't belong to any single time period, like someone had been collecting, curating, assembling a version of the world meant to be preserved underground. There were bundles of cash, mostly 1,970 bills, brittle and marked. There were black and white photos of unknown cities, grainy and overexposed, taped in groups of 3. There was a folded military-style map labeled Southwest Contingency Network with colored dots spread across Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California. Some dots were marked out in red ink, others were circled. One circled twice matched the exact coordinates where Jason and Melissa had been found. But the most jarring item was a simple envelope. Yellowed, handwritten, sealed with a single piece of brittle tape. On the front, "To whom it may concern." The team opened it slowly, gloves on, lights low. Inside was a single letter, dated July 13, 2001. No name, no address, just a page and a confession. A belief, a reason, a warning. They read it once, then again. Because if the signature in the notebook had been a mystery, the letter confirmed something far stranger. This shelter wasn't just built to survive a war. It had become a tomb by design, one someone had prepared for someone else. The letter was handwritten, ink slightly faded, but legible slanted print, deliberate strokes, the kind of writing that feels rehearsed, memorized. The world is ending. I don't know when, but it will. The signs are there, the systems are cracks waiting to split, and when they do, this place is where we survive. There was no greeting, no signature, just thought streamed directly from paranoia to page. I built this for when the time came. I stocked it, sealed it. It's not meant to last forever, just long enough to wait out the worst. Below the opening paragraph, a shift. I wasn't going to bring anyone. I told myself it was just mine. But I saw them, Jason and Melissa. They reminded me of what mattered before the world changed. I brought them here to save them. The rest of the page descended into something else. Repetitions. Circular logic. I didn't trick them. They agreed. They were tired. They knew something was coming too. We all did. They said yes. They stepped inside. And finally, at the bottom. They didn't make it. I stayed too long. I couldn't go back for them. I think the place didn't want them to leave. The signature matched the notebook. AT. It wasn't just a name anymore. It was a motive. He'd built the bunker or found it, claimed it, filled it with supplies, turned it into a haven or a trap, depending on your interpretation. And then he'd brought Jason and Melissa into the fold. Not by force, not by violence, but through belief, conviction. He thought he was saving them, and maybe they believed it too. The map found in the chest showed more than one site, locations across the Mojave and beyond, some likely just ruins, others maybe still buried, still sealed, waiting. Authorities scanned the photos, searched for clues. They found images of desert terrain, anonymous buildings, distant highways. One showed a hatch nearly identical to the one in the Mojave. Different coordinates scrawled on the back in pencil. There could be more. More bunkers. More stories. More names lost to time and concrete. Jason and Melissa were found. But AT's legacy wasn't buried with them. It had only just begun to surface. The debate began almost immediately. Psychologists, Survival experts and conspiracy historians filled panels and podcasts, dissecting the evidence, the bunker, the journals, the photos, the letter, and most of all, A.T. Was he a paranoid visionary? Or just unwell? Some insisted A.T. suffered from untreated delusional disorder, possibly compounded by isolation and a Cold War-era obsession with global collapse. They pointed to his ramblings in the notebook, the obsessive markings on maps, the cryptic references to signals and timelines. A classic case of bunker syndrome, one expert said. A man who built a box, then convinced himself the world outside was burning. But others weren't so sure. They argued the letter was too coherent, the planning too methodical. A.T. may have been paranoid, but he was prepared. And Jason and Melissa, well, educated, rational, grounded, had followed him. Willingly. That fact complicated everything. Because if they were tricked, there should have been signs, panic, notes, struggle. But there was only Melissa's journal, quiet, reflective, resigned. She didn't write about fear. She wrote about waiting. Maybe the desert swallowed us. Or maybe this place was meant to. And there was the locked hatch. No tampering, no damage, no external seal. They had locked themselves in, whether out of trust, or belief, or fear. Friends of the couple were split. Some said Jason had been drawn to survivalist forums in his final months. Others recalled Melissa becoming increasingly anxious about political unrest and climate events. Neither ever mentioned A.T., but maybe they didn't know his name, only the idea he planted. A man who believed the world was ending, and convinced two others to join him underground. Theories spiraled. Maybe they were cult-like followers, maybe survivalist recruits, maybe they thought it was a test, or that they'd emerge when the chaos passed. But the world hadn't ended. The world had moved on, and they'd been waiting, beneath the sand, for 9 years. No clear answers, no perfect conclusions. Only the enduring question: did Jason and Melissa die because they were deceived, or because, in some dark corner of their minds, they believed? 30. What the desert keeps. The Mojave has always been a place of extremes, of blistering heat and endless silence, a place that swallows sound, shifts landscapes, and buries history without ceremony. Jason and Melissa Hart didn't vanish in a storm or fall into some canyon. They weren't taken by wildlife or lost to the wind. They chose a door, stepped inside, and never came back out. Their story isn't just one of mystery, it's one of belief. They believed something was coming an end, a collapse, a moment when the world outside no longer made sense. Whether that belief was born from fear or planted by A.T., no one will ever fully know. But they acted on it, and in doing so, became part of something far larger. The bunker has since been sealed again, not destroyed, preserved technically for historical purposes, marked and logged in a government file with the kind of label that ensures it's mostly forgotten. The red X remains on the copy of the map. Sarah keeps it in a shadow box, alongside Melissa's journal and the photo of the hatch taken on their last day above ground. She doesn't speak publicly anymore. She doesn't need to. The world moved on, but it never stopped wondering. The desert gave up its dead, but it didn't give up its secrets. How many other bunkers lie beneath the sand? How many coordinates, scribbled on old paper or saved in forgotten GPS logs, point to places no one should ever enter? And how many others like A.T. are out there still watching, still waiting? In the end, the desert didn't kill Jason and Melissa. It simply kept them, wrapped in concrete and silence, preserved beneath a hatch never meant to reopen, and all for a belief that somewhere out there the world had already ended. It wasn't just about how they died. It was about why they hid. Why two people, in love and full of life, stepped willingly into a place built for fear. Some say they were lost. Others say they were found. But the Mojave doesn't care. It only keeps what it's given. And it doesn't always give it back. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.